everybody, and welcome to this session on chunky crochet. I'm so pleased to see you here, and I'm even more pleased that you've decided to give chunky garments a go. I know they can look a little bit intimidating and they can look very bulky, so hopefully I can share some tips with you today as to how to make them very wearable. If we haven't met before, my name is Claire and I'm really pleased to see you here, and I'd love it even more if I got to see you at King and I. You can find me on social and at the website at King and I, which is EYE King and I. I'll pop some links in there for you below, and I'd love to see you there. So, chunky crochet. What is chunky crochet? Well, basically it's my life. I absolutely love it. Let me just show you some examples and you'll see why. Just look at the texture on this. Isn't it beautiful? The stitch definition, the texture, the drama. You know, every time you wear something like this, everyone's going to ask you where you got it from. Did you make it yourself? They're just going to love it. You know, there's just so much there. So whenever I'm scrolling through Pinterest or Instagram, it's always the chunky crochet that catches my eye. You know, it's just, there's just so much texture there, so much interest. So I love the definition and the texture. Let me just show you this one as well. This is the balloon sleeve bomber, and this is the pattern that I will be sharing with you throughout this summit. Everyone loves the sleeves on the balloon sleeve bomber, and it's the definition and the texture that you get with the chunky yarns that just makes chunky crochet for me. So why would you want to crochet chunky garments? Well, we all know that chunky crochet is a great attention grabber, but you may be asking, why not just use it for blankets or for home decor? You know, you can make some beautiful cushions and very cozy blankets with chunky crochet, and I'm sure you might have tried that already. But you know, everyone loves a nibbly knobbly cushion while they're sat watching Netflix, and you run your fingers over those blankets, you know, and wrap yourself up in them, and you're so wonderfully cozy. And I just got to that point where I just thought, well, you know, they do make great talking pieces for people who come into your home, not to mention they're very quick to whip up. But, you know, when we all fancy a bit of a change in the sitting room, but why limit to that attention to your home? You know, why not wear this texture? Why not go out in it? Why not wrap yourself up in it all the time? So I didn't want to limit myself to being at home. So I don't know about you, but I am always cold. Even in the height of summer, I need several layers on. So I wanted to take that cozy, fuzzy blanket feeling with me whenever I went out of the house. And like I said before, you know, if you're wearing something like this beautiful chunky scarf or the cardigan that I showed you before, people will always ask you, where did you get that? Did you make it yourself? And it just grabs so much attention. So with chunky crochet, what should you be looking out for in a pattern? Well, really, you know, they can be quite different from their finer counterparts. I've got a slightly more delicate scarf here that is on the website if you're interested in that. And, you know, you can see that there's quite a lot of difference there in the texture between the two scarves. The most obvious is obviously being the fabric. It's so much denser on the chunky crochet. So we need to think about a little bit about drape and how well our fabric is going to drape. And there's several ways that we can do that, because obviously nobody wants to be walking around in a great big thick chunky blanket. So when we think about the drape, we need to think about it well enough to look like we've intended it as a piece of clothing and not just wrap that rug around our shoulders. So if we think about crochet itself, it's quite different to knitting. You can see with the crochet here, and obviously you'll know if you're a regular crocheter, you're going to be working through 2 loops of the stitch here, and so you effectively have a double fabric. And you can see, if I show you, if you're into knitting, by the way, I do a lot of chunky knits as well as chunky crochet. You can see with the knit, which is made in exactly the same yarn, in the same size needle as the hook that I use for the scarf, the knitting drapes so much more easily because it is a single layer. You know, you can see I can poke my finger through it quite easily. There is only one layer of fabric here, so it drapes wonderfully, whether that's done on a 12-metre hook. The crochet, however, is 2 layers, so we really need to think about how we're going to do that so that it feels less dense and that it drapes so nicely. So if we work a comparable stitch depth, for example, if we're working a swatch of US single crochet and a swatch of stockinette stitch in knitting, which is the typical kind of V stitch that you would see on sweaters like this here, you'd see that the knitted swatch is so much softer and it drapes so much more easily. So how do we ensure that our projects will drape well with crochet as well as they do in knitting? There's several options that we can use as designers, and the first thing is a hook size. So like I mentioned before, I use the same yarn for the jumper and for the sweater, but for the hooks I went up a size. So, you know, something like this really is probably best, a 12mm hook. So we can use a larger hook than is recommended on the yarn label. The yarn label for this yarn is 10mm, so I would always go up at least a couple of millimeters, and that gives us a bigger stitch and the stitches move more easily against each other then. And we can also look at stitch patterns. As I mentioned above, if we try to design crochet pieces with stitches that are a similar size to their knitted cousins, then we have twice the thickness of fabric. So how do we counteract this? Well, we can use taller stitches. They help to create more drape. It may help to look for projects that use US double crochet stitches, because those taller stitches are going to allow a little bit more space and movement between the pillars of the stitch. We can also allow shell-based or lace stitches, because they have a lot more space between the stitches, and that allows the projects to move more easily. Sometimes though, myself included, the designer will use shorter stitches to create a certain look. If you want a very kind of cozy feel, like for example with this hat, you know, I used half double crochet here, and it is a very thick fabric, but that's the look that I intended with this hat. In terms of garments, for the balloon sleeve bomber, which, you know, is one of my best selling patterns, it is a very dense fabric, and again I used half double crochet for that, but this was the texture that I was looking for. I wanted something very dense and something very, very cozy, because I wanted that dramatic look for the sleeves, and I wanted something that can act more or less as an outer layer. I quite often will wear this as a jacket rather than indoors. Not to stop you wearing it indoors, but it is a super thick and cozy cardigan. So this was a look that I had deliberately used a shorter stitch for. So don't dismiss it if you see a pattern that is in single crochet or half double crochet or more dense stitches. It may be that the designer has used that stitch on purpose to give it more of a dense look, or it may be that they've gone up a hook size, so even though it's a shorter stitch, you should still get the drape that you're looking for. If it's a designer that you trust, they will have thought of that already. So in terms of creating the chunky garments, now that you have a pattern that you're looking forward to creating, you really don't need anything special. You can still use all the usual measuring, blocking favourites. The only thing is you may have to invest in a couple of larger hooks. You don't need to spend a lot of money on these. I have several available on the website. Most crochet sets don't contain the specialist larger hooks that we use in our chunky garments. Obviously, check the pattern before you go out and spend a fortune on various websites. Usually a 10mm or a 12mm hook will do. Even with the very, very chunky size 6 super bulky yarns that I tend to work with a lot, you really need to go higher than a 12mm hook. Although I do love my 20mm hook, which does get used rarely, more for homeware projects, but it tends to just sit there looking pretty on my shelf. Really, I would recommend probably the 10 and 12mm. That's what you're going to get most use out of, and they're really not very expensive if you want to give chunky crochet a try. So in terms of hook materials, as you can imagine, the larger the hook, the heavier it's going to be. So, you can see some absolutely stunning solid wood hooks out there on the market, and they're beautiful to look at, but they can be quite heavy to use, and that could cause a bit of strain on your wrists more than you would feel with a lighter, smaller hook. So usually I would recommend looking for something in bamboo. Bamboo is very, very light, and depending on the yarn that you're using, you may prefer to use a bamboo hook as it's a little bit stickier. So if it's a very slippery yarn that you're using, maybe bamboo might suit you. Or you will see a lot of acrylic type hooks as well. So this is a ergonomic style that I use quite a lot. Or if you like a bit of sparkle in your life, I have these wonderful ones on the website. A little bit of glitter in there as well, just to make it even more interesting. If you are looking for something that works up very, very quickly, there are metal versions out there. I couldn't find my really chunky one. It's obviously in a project bag somewhere. But something like this, you want to look for something that has a plastic handle just to make it a little bit lighter. And this end should be hollow so that it's not too heavy to work with, because the last thing we want is for you to strain your wrists and your hands and not be able to finish the project, even though they're generally super quick to work up. So, gauge and tension, how important are they in crochet garments when they're chunky? Well, yes, it's very important. I know it's really, really tempting just to grab your yarn and your hook and to dive right into that pattern, and you want to really get going because you want to wear it out next week. But there really is no excuse for not creating a gauge swatch and, unfortunately, blocking it before you start your work. The blocking is especially important with chunky projects, because you want to get a very, very accurate gauge swatch. Because if you think about it, each of all of these stitches can be, I don't know, it could be 2-3 times larger than a project that you've been used to working with. So what you need to think about, if you have a stitch that is 4 times larger, and each stitch, even if it's a 1/4 centimetre larger than it should be in your gauge stitch, it's going to mean that over the space of 40 stitches you've added 10 centimetres to that piece, which is much more noticeable than it would be on a finer piece. But obviously the worst thing is if each of your stitches is even just a 1/4 centimetre smaller than on the gauge swatch, that means that you've then lost 10 centimetres, and no one wants to put all that work into a garment to find out that it only fits their teddy bear. So it's really, really important that you check your gauge before you start on the project, and make sure it is as accurate as you can by blocking that gauge swatch before you start. So, blocking. How important is it to block your project when you've finished? Well, no matter what yarn material you've chosen for your garment, these stitches are going to be pretty bulky, and especially if they're created in size 5 bulky yarns or size 6 super bulky yarns. And like we said before, you know, if you're creating something like the balloon sleeve bomber and you're creating it in shorter stitches, then you really need to block that project to make sure that it flows and it drapes the way the designer has envisaged that it would do. I don't know about you, but I'm a very tight crocheter, so quite often by the time I've finished a project it feels quite dense, and it doesn't flow as much as I would like it to. But once I've blocked it, generally they are transformed, and they will move so much more nicely for you once you've blocked it properly, and you can make sure it's blocked to the right measurements as well. So going back to that gauge before, you know, if you've been ever so slightly out on each stitch, by the time you've done 10, 20, 30, 40 stitches, you can imagine how much smaller or larger a piece could be. So blocking it out to the right sizes and to the measurements in the pattern is super important with chunky crochet. So the other thing, of course, that's important with blocking is excuse me, quite often with the chunky crochet projects, we will design them in several pieces. And the reason that we do that and we seam them, I know seaming is frustrating and everyone loves a top-down project, myself included. You know, this project here, the St. Ives project, is a top-down raglan, and it's wonderful to be able to just carry on and know that when you finish you've just got a couple of ends to weave in. But with the heavier garments like the balloon sleeve bomber, you know, they are pretty heavy by the time you've finished, and no one wants to wear something that they've put a lot of work into and for it to stretch out of shape the first few times you wear it or the first time you wash it. So quite often chunky crochet pieces will be made in pieces and then seamed, and those seams really do act nicely to hold your garment into the shape that it should sit in long term. So what kind of seams could you create? Well, whatever works for you, really. My favourites tend to be either back stitching together or maybe slip stitch seaming the two pieces together. Just be careful that you don't do it too tightly, because it could get quite bulky. So you know, you need to just try out a few things. Maybe if you've done a few swatches, try a couple of seams with different stitches to see which is the least bulky for you, and to create the look that you would like. It may be that you would prefer to do the seam on the outside in a contrasting colour, for example, in which case a slip stitch or a single crochet seam would work really well to give it that design element. So I hope that's helped. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything else that you would like to see, and I hope you'll give chunky crochet a go, and particularly the balloon sleeve bomber. I'd love to see that. Do tag me on Instagram @KingandI, and I'd love to share your projects with the community. So I hope to see you there soon. Bye bye.